would like to introduce a very special guest. As a child, her neighborhood was targeted by the KKK. As a teenager, she was threatened as she tried to organize interracial study groups. As an adult, she was harassed by the police and jailed for her political activity. She's an author, an educator, and the very definition of a change agent. It's my honor to introduce Angela Davis in conversation with our Keturah Herron, ACLU of Kentucky policy strategist.
First off, just thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. I'm Keturah Herron with the ACLU of Kentucky, and I'm a policy strategist here located in Louisville, Kentucky. And so thank you so much for your time. And so I want to get right into everything. In the last few weeks, as I've been doing some research, learning more about you, one of the things that I learned was that you spent some time in Louisville, Kentucky, and you spent some time with Ann and Carl Braden, and at the work that they were doing.
Okay, well, first I think it would be important for me to share with you my introduction to the Bradens. I was very young then. I think I was probably about 15 years old when I was living with a family in New York, attending my last 2 years of high school there. It was the family of William Howard Mellish, a minister who had been ousted from his church because of charges having to do with anti-communism. He had actually worked with the Council for American-Soviet Relations and was friends with W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and others. He was also really close friends with Ann and Carl Braden. And after he was ousted from his church, he joined the staff of the Southern Conference Educational Fund, where Ann and Carl were field secretaries. And I think it's important that people know that SCEF was a really important source of support for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the more radical wing of what we know as the Civil Rights Movement. And so my first introduction to them was reading Ann's book, The Wall Between. And I also heard a great deal about Reverend Mellish when he would make trips to the South to do work for SCEF. And one of the most vivid memories of those years is a visit from Carl Braden when he was about to turn himself in after having been sentenced to prison for refusing to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was my introduction. And we don't have enough time to talk about the entire story, but I will say that after I was arrested, they were very much involved in the campaign for my freedom. And both Carl and Ann were involved in the organization we created after my trial was over, the National Alliance Against Racism and Political Repression. Carl was an officer of the organization, and then later Ann was. Carl died in 1975, but I continued to learn from Ann. We worked together for many, many years. And perhaps I can just point out that shortly after my release, I was invited to speak in Louisville. Mm-hmm. And I was supposed to speak at Central High School, but there were protests by the Ku Klux Klan and others, and I guess the city withdrew the agreement to hold the meeting at Central High School. But Reverend Schroederlook I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who was a white minister in Louisville, offered his church, and the rally took place. I should tell you that I've been given the keys to the city of Louisville. I was given the key and it was taken away, and I was given another key. So yeah, I have a long history in Louisville, but most recently in about 2002, I accepted an offer to teach for a semester at the University of Louisville in the Department of Women and Gender Studies, largely because I knew that I would be able to spend time with Anne. And during that time, I got to know Carla Wallace, who's a very close friend and comrade. So I feel as if I have major ties to Louisville.
I guess the question I want to ask you is, how do you see the work from the previous administration impacting the work that Biden and Harris will have to do, and what should we expect to see from our current administration?
Well, I don't think we can wait and see. I guess that would be my response. I don't think that we can assume that if we simply sit back, that this current administration will move in the right direction. I think it's clear that the only reason the previous occupant of the White House is no longer there is because people organized. They got out the vote. They engaged in really phenomenal work. And that work has to continue. And let me just say parenthetically, I think the mistake we made during the Obama administration was to sit back after he was elected. And not nearly as much was accomplished during that time as could have been accomplished had we had mass organizing and mobilizations and pressure on his administration. We have to do this for the Biden, with respect to the Biden-Harris administration.
I do want to ask you, I know that one of the first things that we saw from the Biden and Harris administration was that they did an executive order. They did an executive order to end private prisons with DOJ. And so hearing that on the surface, it sounds like, oh, that is a great thing. But like, what does that really mean? Like, what does it really mean to that they have put this executive order out there? And yeah, just what does that mean, and what does that mean to the work as far as abolition?
Well, I think it's important that he did it. Perhaps more symbolically than anything else. Private prisons only incarcerate about 10% of the federal prison population, not very much. And what really disturbed me about that order, and we have to be really careful in our analysis so we don't get caught up in the kind of enthusiasm that can dull our ability to understand what is really going on. His order exempted ICE. It exempted Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And if one looks at the prison privatization issue, it is clear that immigrant detention is the most profitable dimension of private prisons. And so if anything substantive is going to happen, then certainly ICE, well, first of all, ICE should be abolished, but certainly the privatization of immigrant detention needs to be abolished. I think it's important to point out that we're not opposed to private prisons in order to have better government-run prisons. The whole point is to abolish imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, and to recognize that an important element of that struggle has to do with contesting the role of capitalism. And so privatization helps us to understand um, how mass incarceration emanates from global capitalism. But simply getting rid of privatization is not going to solve the problem.
Yeah. So would you? So based on like the things that you're saying, it sounds like to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we need to continue to put pressure on to make sure that our immigrant brothers and sisters are let out of cages, and to definitely hit on the ICE piece and work on really abolishing that structure and system.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's remember that Obama had already ended the contractual relationship with private prisons. It was the last occupant who reinstated it, and actually um, made it possible for private prison companies like Core Civic to see their stock rise in value. So we're kind of where we were at the beginning, which isn't really saying much. And I think that as radical activists, we should acquire the habit of not becoming self-satisfied when something positive happens, but rather using it as the terrain for a continuing to move forward in radical directions. And I think that is what we really need to be doing now.
Yes, I love that. I want to now shift the conversation a little bit and talk about some of the things that we saw this summer in the murder of Breonna Taylor that happened here in Louisville, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, and other people. We saw protests all around in all 50 states, I think in 17 or 18 different countries. I know here in Kentucky, we saw protests in communities that we had no idea that there were people there standing in solidarity with black folks. And so we saw young people filling the streets. We saw elderly people filling the streets. It was just this large movement that I think that for many of us, it's the first time that we've seen something so huge and so impactful in our lifetime that we were able to witness. And so you have protesters, you have elected officials, you have folks who do policy, just a wide variety of people. And so there are many strategies and tactics to win. And so I guess my question is how do we bring people together to work on a collaborative agenda for Black liberation and for racial justice?
Oh, well, you know, I've been around for a while. I've participated in many, many movements. I've seen many demonstrations, but I've never seen anything like what we experienced last summer. And I don't think that uh, there's ever been a period in the history of this country where so many people have simultaneously joined in the call for an end to racism in this country. It's of course, social media has a lot to do with the fact that it's possible to mobilize people. Sometimes it seems almost spontaneously, but I think the key factor was the ongoing organizing that has been happening, particularly since the death of Trayvon Martin. You mentioned a book that I wrote in the aftermath of the Ferguson protests. Freedom is a constant struggle. And the subtitle is Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations for a Movement. Because I wasn't yet certain that we could declare that we had a powerful movement against racism um, all over the country, but it was clear that the foundational work had been done. It was clear that the organizing work was ongoing. And, and so when George Floyd was murdered, when Breonna Taylor was murdered, and so many others, people who had been hearing these messages from anti-racist organizers all along, but who perhaps had not responded, realized, almost in a kind of collective epiphany, that something has to be done. This had to do, of course, with the fact that finally, large numbers of people began to recognize the nature of racism and that it is structural and systemic and institutional rather than personal and individual. And I think that the confluence of the pandemic, which allowed us to see very clearly the nature of structural racism, because so many more Black people, so many more Indigenous people, Latinx people have been hurt by the pandemic and are dying. That consciousness sort of clicked, and people felt the need to collectively join all of those who believe that changes need to happen in this country. And I mean, it's so remarkable that millions of people poured out into the streets, as you point out, not only all over the country and in places where we never imagined that there would be such protests, but all over the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, in Europe, of course. And this is something that is very special. And by itself, such a response does not necessarily bring about change, but it creates the terrain for the production of radical change. And I think it's important that people recognize that now, even though it's a quieter moment, we don't have the millions of people out in the streets, there is an enormous amount of work being done. And this is precisely the time to begin the work to pass new legislation, to reorganize various kinds of organizations, to look and identify the role that structural racism has played in these formations, educational organizations, cultural organizations, healthcare, the whole range of social organizations in this country.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that you kind of have been hitting on throughout is organizing. Like, I continue to hear you talk about, it's the continuous organizing, and that is what is going to get us free. I feel like that I've heard you before talk about it's organizing, and then there's a moment or the time is right, and these things happen and occur. Can you break down a little bit more about the distinction between organizing and mobilization? I think that some of our young people who are finding the movement and finding their voice are really battling with what that means and what that looks like. And so, can you talk a little bit about the difference between mobilization and the organizing piece?
Well, sometimes we tend to get addicted to the intensity of moments when masses of people are in the streets, when we're all hearing about the issue of fighting racism, not only in social media, but in the established media. And of course, we experienced that last summer, and it was remarkable. However, that was a demonstration of work that had already been done. I like to think about demonstrations as demonstrating the existence of movements and making visible the work that is usually largely invisible. The development of consciousness, the creation of new organizations, the work on a local level. Often one doesn't see immediate results to that work. And as people who live in this capitalist society, we're accustomed to wanting the immediacy of outcomes and consequences. I know foundations always ask, well, what is the 1-year outcome? Or, what is the 2-year outcome? 5 years seems a long time. But actually, it often takes even longer for that work to settle in and to begin to constitute a different kind of consciousness for masses of people. At least more than half of the people in this country, if one looks at the vote that went down. And so we have to be very careful about developing strategy that will allow those people who have been misled to eventually join us. And this is why I think Louisville is so important, because Louisville has despite all of the issues, and you know better than I, and the horrendous police murder of Breonna Taylor, but Louisville also has, thanks to the work of people like Ann and Carl Braden, a tradition of white people doing work, radical anti-racist work. Carla Wallace, for example, the Fairness Campaign, which created alliances between Black communities and the church communities and the LGBTQ community. Nothing like that was happening in the country. So I think of Louisville as expressing a lot of the contradictions that we have to begin to work through if we're going to move forward.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I will lift up after the verdict came down of that there wouldn't be charges against the police officers. That evening, we were trying to decide what we're going to do with all the people, and it was our white allies who opened up their church at First Unitarian Church, and we marched and took the protesters there to an actual safe place. And so thank you for laying that context, because we still have those allies, and they are still doing work with us here. One of the things that we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement in the very beginning became this Blue Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that I talk about was that Black Lives Matter, you're talking about a group of people, and Blue Lives Matter, you're talking about an occupation, basically. And so I know that here in Louisville, we are really fighting and battling policing in a different way, out front in a different way than we have previously. The work has been happening, but not so much out in front. And so my question for you is, what is it? What do you think it is to? What does it mean to be a Black police officer today, in this moment in time?
Yeah, on a number of occasions, Black police officers have played really critical roles, but we're talking about an institution that should no longer exist. And I think that the best role that existing Black police officers can play is in helping us to reimagine a different notion of security and safety. And certainly when you say abolish the police, so many police officers think about this as a personal issue and think about the fact that what we're saying is that you don't deserve to have those jobs anymore. But we're talking about a very different world. We're talking about moving into the future where the individuals who are police officers, whether they're white or whether they're people of color, should be able to imagine playing new roles and being more productive in those new roles. Uh, but of course, we work within contradictions. We work with contradictions and within contradictions. And I don't think that we should allow those contradictions to deter us from moving forward.
With those things in mind, and we know that there's qualified immunity that police officers have, and we've seen different different other pieces of legislation, and so how do we hold police accountable, knowing that we want to, at the end of the day, take away these carceral systems? So like, what is the how do we do that? How do we battle that contradiction?
I mean, that's a really important question. And, and I would once again suggest that perhaps we have to better learn how to work within contradictions. Uh, and in this particular case, uh, can we both call for an end to qualified immunity and point out that we need new ways of making people accountable, that we don't want to use the same systems that are responsible for police violence, for racist police violence, to discipline the police who engage in that violence. To me, that only perpetuates the violence we are trying to end. But it doesn't mean that we don't hold police accountable. It doesn't tell us how to create the kind of accountability that is going to make our society stronger, that's going to make the relationships among the people in our society more powerful.
I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about ACLU. And so we know that ACLU historically has been, we're a group that historically has specifically worked on things regarding the Constitution and protecting constitutional rights. And now we've seen ACLU starting to shift a little bit in its role in the work from the Constitution to really digging deep into racial justice and fighting racial injustice. And so the question I want to ask you is, what role do you believe that ACLU should be playing in this current movement? And do you believe that organizations such as ACLU is hurtful or helpful to the current movement?
Well, I have a long relationship with the ACLU, and it's been a critical relationship. I've been, very critical of some strategies, but I also recognize that the ACLU has played an absolutely essential role in bringing us to the point where we are today. Many, many years ago, when most legal organizations did not really take prisoner issues seriously, the ACLU had a national prison project. And when I was working with the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, we did an enormous amount of work with the ACLU, and that was really pioneering work that the ACLU as a legal formation was doing. It helped to lead to things like the Abolitionist Law Project today. So I think that the ACLU has played an absolutely essential role. And also I should say that the ACLU did work around my case. So I'm personally thankful for the support of the ACLU and the work that that the organization has done around so many other political prisoners. So yes, we need legal support. We need legal defense. We need especially at a time when enormous numbers of people are being drawn into the movement, and when uh, there are mobilizations and protests and arrests. We definitely need an organization like the ACLU to defend our right to engage in radical opposition, radical protests. And so I'm really thankful to the ACLU, and the Kentucky ACLU has a very long history, and thank you for your work, especially around the Breonna Taylor case, but around so many other issues as well.
Thank
We
you.
absolutely need the ACLU.
We need the ACLU, y'all. That's what I was hoping. I know that, a lot of times, sometimes in my role, I battle with being someone who's very close to the ground and doing strategy and organizing in community. And sometimes we hear community folks wanting us to do more, or telling us that we're not doing enough, or saying you all need to be doing this, or you all need to stay out of our business and let the grassroots folks do this piece. And so I just thank you for those words. But I do think as we are
Well,
moving,
listen, you wouldn't be those responses if you weren't doing work. So that's par for the course, I think. There's always going to be criticisms,
yeah,
and that's okay.
yeah,
And it's all right to be critical and at the same time do the work. This is one of the things I've learned from feminist strategies, from Audre Lorde, for example. We don't have to let these critiques serve as barriers. We can work within contradictions. We can be afraid and still do the work. We don't have to be instinctively courageous to get out here and do this. I like the idea of doing work despite the contradiction, despite the critique, or perhaps precisely because of the contradiction, because of the critique.
yeah. Thank you for that. And that brings another question to mind. Is and I've heard you talk about before the conflict that's often happens within movements, and that conflict is needed. And can you just talk more about when there is conflict within the movement? And I've heard people say we need conflict because just because I said it doesn't mean that is the way the lay of the land. And so, how do we take situations where there is a conflict or disagreement, and use that as a tool to continue to build and grow?
Well, I think conflict and disagreement enable us to sharpen our analysis. We should not be afraid of conflict. I I welcome conflict because conflict is a driving force. And as someone who has been teaching for many, many decades, I always let my students know that I don't want them to take what I say as the truth simply because I'm saying it. I want them to examine um, not only everything else, but I want them to the examine my ideas and the ways in which I'm encouraging them to be critical. And I think that we have the tendency to assume that everybody has to be in agreement in order to move forward. But when everybody is in agreement, there's a kind of quiet that can lead us to lay back and not do anything at all. We need the conflict because it generates movement, it generates force, it allows us to come up with new ideas. And don't be afraid of the conflict. Um, yeah, we have to learn how to embrace it.
Thank you so much for your time. It has been a pleasure and a huge honor to have been able to spend this time with you today.